Let's take a moment to talk about game objects. In Unity, everything in your scene is a game object. But what is that? Let's look at some of the game objects to get a better understanding. If I click on the main camera, we can see it's got a preview, but we can also see it in the inspector. The name of the game object will be at the top, and there will be a checkbox next to it that will let you enable or disable it. Right now it's enabled. If I uncheck it, it's disabled. So it's still in our hierarchy window, but it's grayed out, so it's not really part of the game at this moment. If I click back on it and check that, I've turned it back on. Every game object is just a configuration of various components. The transform component is the first one you see there. It comes with a position, a rotation, and a scale, so it knows where it is, it knows how it's oriented, and it knows how large it is. This is the only component which all game objects will have. If I click on the little gearbox next to this component, there is no remove component option. Any of the other components will have that. For instance, the camera component, if I click on the gearbox, I can say remove component if I wanted to. Just like I can remove components, I can add components. For any game object, you can add and remove as many components as you want, but the transform will be always there. You can create game objects in various ways, but one way is to come up to the Game Object tab, go to 3D Object. You can choose any 3D object you want there. You could go to lights. All of these are game objects. You could go to a camera. You could go to video. These are all different game objects that when you add them to the scene, they will have a configuration of components that are just for that type of object. For instance, another way I can make a game object is by right-clicking in the hierarchy window, and we get that same list. If I went to a 3D object cube, it adds a cube to our hierarchy and to our scene. If I zoom into that, I can see where it put it. It kind of put it underneath the room. You can also see where I put it there. X, Y, and Z, they're not at the center. I'm going to reset, and that resets the position, rotation, and scale. That puts it in the center of our world, which happens to be in the center of our room. I do want to drag it up a little bit so that it's above the ground, actually a little bit floating in the air. And now you can see that the Y value has changed. Now this cube didn't just come with a transform. It also came with a cube mesh. I cannot uncheck and check that component to turn it on and off, but I could remove it if I wanted to. I could say remove component. Here's the mesh renderer. So what is the mesh? It's what wraps around this object. If I uncheck it, I see that the cube is still there, but the mesh is not going to show now. I want to turn that component back on. The next component is a box collider. This means that there is a collider on it and that things can collide with it. If I turn that off, you'll see the green lighting go away because the green lighting was the collider. If I turn the mesh also, I see a darker green lighting. That's not the collider. If I turn the collider back on, it's a brighter green there. Turn this back on. Let's look at another component I could add. I could right click a light, for instance, and maybe make a spotlight. There's an example of a spotlight. You can see again, this is called spotlight. It's got a transform, and then it's got these other components, in this case just one called light. And it's got a bunch of properties that come with that component. One of them is the type of light, so even though it's a spotlight, I could change it and make it a directional light now. And even though it's called a spotlight, it's actually a directional light. I can remove that component completely. Now, even though it's called a spotlight, it's actually just an empty game object. It's a game object that only has a transform. I'm going to right-click on the spotlight in the hierarchy and delete it. I can also right-click and say create an empty game object. You can see that's just an empty game object. It has nothing inside of it. It has no components except for the transform. So it does have a location, it has a rotation, it has a scale, and it may not seem that the scale and the rotation have any effect on it. If I rotate this here, you don't see it spinning. If I change the scale of this empty game object, it doesn't seem to change either. However, if you click on the gearbox and say reset, so it's back to the center of the world, maybe move it up a little bit, over a little bit so we can see it. Now let's see what happens when we put something inside of it. Let's say we put this cube inside this game object. It doesn't seem to have moved. It did all the translations for us. So now when I look at the cube, the position has changed because it's now being positioned based on where the game object is. Because the game object was 2.58 over, then the cube had to go negative 2.58 to get back to the center. If I drag the cube back out of the empty game object, then you see that the z is at 0. So it automatically, to keep it in the same place in the scene, makes the changes it needs as it's added as a child to another object. What this means is that even though changing the rotation and scale doesn't seem to affect it, it does affect the things inside of it. For instance, if I rotate the game object now, I see that this cube is rotating around the center of that game object because the game object is actually rotating. If I make the scale of the game object larger, it's going to affect the things that are inside of it, in that case the cube. Now if I come back and look at cube, it still says the scale is 111 because it is. Its scale hasn't changed, but the object it's inside of has. So what I want to do here, if I have an empty game object that I'm really just kind of using as a folder, is I just want to keep that always at position 000, rotation 000, and scale of 111. And then if I want to resize anything inside of that empty game object, I can go to that specific object and mess with it there. I'm going to move that cube back out of the empty game object. I'm going to delete the empty game object. And I want to talk about this cube a little more. Get it back into the center, floating in the air. And I want to show how this collider works. So if I press run and look around, I must be under it. There it is. It's a little too high and I want it to be in front of me also. So I'm going to stop, move it in front of my camera. So which way is my camera pointing? If I click on main camera, zoom out a little bit, I can see it's pointing to the left there. But that is not the camera we want to be using. I'm going to actually delete the main camera because the camera we're using is part of our FPS controller. You can see it right there. It is also pointing to the left, but I'm going to drag it back. I don't want to drag the first-person character camera. Instead, I'm going to click on FPS controller, so it's grabbing the camera and the controller and the collider that is on the controller and dragging it back. It's important to note that the first-person controller has a collider because without it, it will not collide with things. And then I'm going to check my cube and drag it down. I want it to be above the ground, but high enough that I'm still going to hit it as the player character. If I press run, there's my cube. Notice it's just floating in the air there. If I run into it or try to run through it, it just doesn't let me. So I cannot run through it, and that's because my collider and its collider are colliding. The physics engine will prevent them from going through each other. If I either delete the collider by hitting the gearbox and saying remove component, or even if I just disable it and press run, it allows me to go right through it because both myself and the cube would need to have a collider for it to prevent me from running through it. What if I want it to have physics applied to it? Well, that's fairly simple to do. We just have to add another component. I'm going to say add component. I'm going to start typing in rigid body. I see we've got some options there. I want just that top one, rigid body. We have added the rigid body component. It's showing right there. You can see it has settings and properties that you can play with. One of them is use gravity. If that's checked on, then gravity will be applied to it. If I press run, we saw it fall there. If I run into it, oh look, now I'm able to kind of push it around because it's a rigid body and physics are being applied to it. What would happen if we did not use gravity? Now it's not falling, but it is still a rigid body. I can still knock it around, but it's just not being affected by any gravity. The reason it's coming down now is because it bounced off the ceiling, and then if I run into it, it's going to knock it somewhere else. So do not confuse what a collider is and what a rigid body is. You're going to be using these quite a bit. In the next lesson, we're going to learn how to use a collider as a trigger. For now, I'm going to delete the cube that we made in this lesson so that our interior scene is back to normal.